All right, thank you so much. I should welcome you, Professor Eaton, once more to this event, and it's an honor indeed to have you in the session. And I must really thank you. I met you last year at the South Asia Institute, and now over a year. It's a great pleasure for me and for us, for dear colleagues and professors in Iran, who can have this great opportunity of speaking with you, and specifically because your book is also translated in Persian, and it's a great opportunity for the Iranian audience to read you in Persian. And thank you so much for your time during, I'm sure it's a busy time of the semester, etc. So
Thank
I'll
you.
just give a brief introduction and then we'll start. Professor Eaton is obviously, as all of us know, is Professor of History at the Department of History, University of Arizona. Is one of the greatest authorities on the Indian subcontinent, especially questions of religion and Islam and conversion. And he has worked on a number of themes in history, including social, cultural, and connecting, social, cultural history to economic history as well as intellectual history. Sufis of Bijapur, 1300 to 1700. Essays on Islam and Indian history. The rise of Islam and the Bengal frontier. Temple desecration and Muslim states in medieval India, and many others, especially a co-edited volume with my dear Professor Indirani Chatterjee, Slavery and South Asian History, and the recent one, India in the Persianate Age, 1000 to 1765. Thank you so much, Professor Eaton.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
So I just give the floor to Dr. Rahmanian and Dr. Morshedlu for the introduction and welcome, and then we can go with the questions after that.
Pleasure to meet you too, Mr. Professor Eaton, and I would like to thank you for in accepting our invitation, and I hope you are doing and feeling well right now. And I would like to thank my dear friends, Mr. Puyane Kui, for all his efforts, and Mr. Dr. Jawad Morshedlu. And the topic of this session is a discussion about your resume and career, and especially about the latest book of you. I mean the book, the esteemed book, India in the Persianate Age. And I eagerly look forward to listening to your lecture and learning from you. And thank you so much, Mr.
Thank you.
Professor.
My
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Yes.
And please, Puya, make sure that Professor Jawad Morshedlu be in the session.
Yes, he's here. Dr. Morshedlu, if
Yeah,
you want to go.
yeah. Actually, I'm here. Thank you. Hello, Dr. Eaton, the dear Professor Eaton, and dear audiences. For me, it's an honor to be in this meeting. I'm here actually as a student to learn about the history of India, and I find the works of Professor Eaton very fascinating. Lots of ways about information about the cultural relation between Iran and India, and saw the topic of Persianate war. Fortunately, the late, maybe the last work of, the late work of Professor Eaton has been translated into Persian recently as Hender Asr Irani Ma'abi, a publisher in Tehran, published the book in Persian. And there are many other books from the professor. And actually, reading these books opens a new perspective to the history of India, especially cultural perspective of Indo-Iranian relations. So here I'm all eager to learn about the history of India, and maybe some questions we pose in the after the the discussion of the professor. Thank you, Puya.
And dear Puya, I would like to mention after Professor Eaton lecture, we have in this session QA part, and we would like the audiences, our dear audiences, participate in this discussion by their questions.
Sure. Thank you so much.
Thank
So, I think I'll start with this general question. When, as a student, we read your work, there's a lot of thematics of social and cultural and overlapping kind of connections with, let's say, economic issues as well. But I wanted to see in this whole entire journey, what was the general historiographic approaches to South Asian history by the time that you were starting, and how did it change over time? Because from my knowledge, kind of general historiographic themes before your work were basically devoted to economic issues and land relations, etc. So I wanted to see what was that space that you wanted to fill, and then make this really huge epistemological change from those frameworks.
Yes. Thank you, Puya. That's a very important question, and well put too. Well, about 10 years ago, I was approached by Penguin Publisher in London, requesting that I write a book, a survey, a large survey of Indian history between, let's say, the 10th century and the 19th century. And I accepted that. But once I accepted, then I had to think about, well, what is it? I mean, how do I do this? How does one think about all of India across 900 years? And if you look at the historiography prior to this, I mean, about 10 years ago, most of the surveys of India approached this period from the perspective of Hindu-Muslim relations. And this is not surprising. As we all know, when the British conquered India and colonized India in the 18th century, 19th century, the 20th century, they used a divide and rule political tactic that divided Hindus and Muslims intentionally in order to project themselves as kind of the objective, impartial party that is above all of this squabbling among Sikhs and Muslims and Hindus and Christians and Parsis and everybody else. And because the British controlled the educational system in India, I mean, they established the universities of Calcutta, Madras, Bombay, and so forth. And because they wrote the history books during the entire colonial period, they understood history of India as one of an ancient India, medieval India, and modern India, which was a projection of European understanding of time onto India. So that just as you have, ancient Europe being Greek and Roman imperial history, followed by the so-called Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, and then finally modern India, modern Europe after the Renaissance. Similarly, people in India, the British colonial rulers, projected this model onto the subcontinent which they were ruling, with ancient India being understood as Hindu, medieval India as being Muslim, and modern India as being British. That was a very distorted and unfortunate understanding of history because it really meant that the entire middle period from the 10th century to the 19th century was equated with the middle period of Europe, which was a dark age when Germanic tribes came and conquered Rome and they overthrew the Roman Empire and introduced Europe into this period of stagnation and darkness. And that same model was projected onto India. With a view, of course, to presenting the British period, the British colonial period, as one of enlightenment and light and modernity. And so when I was asked by Penguin, of course, it's based in London, the capital of the British Empire, I was asked by them to write this book. I immediately realized that I have to confront this very distorted way of presenting Indian history. And that I was determined not to use religion, specifically Hindu-Muslim relations, which is the way in which most books were presenting this period. As if all of Indian history was a prologue or a preamble to the partition of 1947, which was extremely traumatic for all Indians. And of course, Pakistanis and Indians had very different understanding of the partition. But they both agreed, in a sense, that the primary theme of pre-colonial history was Hindu-Muslim relations. And when you look at the original sources, the primary sources of that same period from the 10th century to the 19th century, especially Persian sources, you do not find a narrative of chronic hostility between Hindus and Muslims. So that presented a problem. I realized that I needed to write this book, but I'm not going to use religion. So what am I going to use? How do I do this? And it was about that time, 10 years ago, that I was reading an important book by a colleague of mine who writes in Sanskrit, or studies Sanskrit literature, Sheldon Pollock. Wrote a very important book, the idea of the Sanskrit cosmopolis. By that, he meant the world in which Sanskrit was used as a language of prestige and a language which established both moral and social order. And this Sanskrit world stretched all the way from Afghanistan, across India, across Central Asia, and Southeast Asia, as far as Vietnam. For example, Kandahar is a Sanskrit word in Afghanistan. Singapore is a Sanskrit word. And so we have this larger world where between the 4th century and the 14th century, Sanskrit had traveled along this immense area as an elite language, which informed everything, not just religion, but much more than religion. It informed economy, aesthetics, art, literature, morality, etiquette, kingship, courtly behavior, grammar. I mean, when you think about it, the literature that was produced in Sanskrit from the 4th century forward covered everything in human experience and established a normative understanding of how the world operates and should operate. So when I thought about the Sanskrit world and how it served to kind of travel above vernacular languages, I mean, you have Pollock establishes this idea that you have two worlds, two kinds of languages. One language is the language that's used around the dinner table at home, in the villages, the vernacular language, which does not necessarily have any literary component. And the second language is a trans-regional one, which travels across huge, vast swaths of space. The closest analog I can think of before the Sanskrit world is the Greek world. After Alexander the Great conquered everything from Greece to the Indus River, establishing this idea of a kind of a Greek cosmopolis, where the Greek language, Greek theater, Greek art, Greek sculpture, all of this was imitated in the world for about 500 years after Alexander. And I mean, it's the reason the New Testament in the Bible was written in Greek, not Aramaic, because Greek was a language of prestige and it had huge geographic breadth. People were using Greek in the entire Mediterranean basin. When the Roman Empire comes along, it too is following the Greek, sending their Roman children to Athens to study Greek, because Greek had the prestige. And the same thing is true with Sanskrit. After the 4th century, especially in the Sanskrit world. Well, I realized that the same thing could be said of Persian. That Persian had a similar experience. That there was a Persian cosmopolis, if you will, or a Persian world that spread far beyond the political boundaries of any Persian empire, extending deep into Central Asia, into the Caucasus, into Anatolia, into India, of course, and indeed into Southeast Asia. During the Mongol period, Persian was the official language used in China, even. When Marco Polo went all the way from Europe to China, the major language he used on the Silk Road was Persian. So I began to understand that you have these two different cosmopolises, two worlds, the Sanskrit and the Persian, which are very parallel. They are both patronizing literature, texts, which travel across a vast space and which happen to overlap in India. This is the major point, I think, of that you have the Sanskrit world, you have the Persianate world, but India is where they overlap, this right here, where you have two cosmopolises, two literary worlds. So I decided to use that as the principal theme that would inform my book. And when I wrote the book, I did not originally have that in mind. I simply started narrating the political history of India. And it almost happened by accident that I was at a dinner party with some colleagues here in Tucson, and one of the members of the party, who was not an academic, not a historian, she asked me, she said, "Dick, what is the argument of your book?" And I did not have an answer, because I didn't really think my book had an argument. But I was not happy with that answer. And that was when I discovered Shelley Pollack. And that is when I discovered the idea of the Sanskrit world, the Sanskrit cosmopolis. And thinking about that, I understood the parallel between the Sanskrit and the Persian worlds are very similar in what they cover. And so in a nutshell, that, Puya, is how I discovered this idea, the Persianate world.
Thank you so much. It is such a fascinating and elaborate answer. I mean, I read the work of Professor Pollack years ago, and
oh yes,
yeah, it is fascinating to see how these fields are really in conversations with one another, and how basically it is thread out through you to the world of the Persian and the Persian cosmopolis, which is a fascinating field and different way of thinking about it. So from what I get, the sense of this Persian cosmopolis is that it's basically there's this model or rather framework of language. There's a worldview that is informing several spheres. Like let's say if economic historians in the earlier period were saying that there's a base and there's a superstructure. This base is economy. It's informing, let's say, the state, etc. Now we have a different framework that it's language, culture that is informing everything else. If I am understanding that correctly.
Correct. And I would say one thing further. Yes, the Sanskrit and the Persian worlds are similar in many respects, but there are also important differences. And for me, the big difference is that the Persian world is actually more cosmopolitan than the Sanskrit world.
How so is that?
The Sanskrit cosmopolis, I mean, in India, really until the 19th century, throughout this period, Sanskrit was confined to Brahmins or Jains. They wrote in Sanskrit, but Sanskrit was not even permitted to be used by non-Brahmins,
Right.
especially writing about religion. As Pollock writes, Sanskrit is understood as a religion of the gods,
Right.
and only the Brahmins have direct contact with the gods.
Right.
And there is a large history in India of non-Sanskrit speaking Hindus using Sanskrit and being punished
Yes.
by the Brahmins, because the Brahmins consider that they only they have access to Sanskrit, and only they should be permitted to use it.
Right.
By contrast, Persian was declared the official language of the Mughal Empire by Akbar, the Emperor Akbar, in 1582, meaning that anybody could learn Persian. And so you have non-Brahmins, as well as Brahmins, but non-Brahmins, especially non-Brahmins, learning Persian in order to run the administrative system, the revenue system, the justice system, but especially revenue, because after all, empires are primarily concerned with money,
Right.
collecting the revenue. Anybody could become a clerk in the Mughal bureaucracy. And that meant that in the same way that English was used by the British, the British did not confine the use of English just to Brahmins. The British were happy to, anyone that wants to learn English can work for the empire. So my point is that in a sense, in social terms, if you look at society, Persian had much deeper penetration into the social structure of India than Sanskrit ever did.
Right.
And that's a very important point
Very important.
that I think we need to understand, because this is why Persian has entered into vernacular languages. When you look at Hindi, probably 25% of Hindi and more than 35% of Urdu is Persian.
Persian.
And the same is true in Bengali, in Marathi, in Kashmiri. All these North Indian languages have a huge Persian component. Why? Because the speakers of these vernacular languages were also learning Persian, because that was the official language of the empire.
Right.
So that's a very interesting phenomenon. But I think the difference between Sanskrit and Persian is equally important to understand.
So just a quick question, clarification maybe on this, is that Persian actually is, anyways, this language of the elite, but it has, what you're suggesting, if I understand it correctly, has more kind of compatibility, or rather kind of ease to get into the kind of vernacular, kind of everyday realm.
Right. You look at Bollywood movies.
Right.
You know, the government is trying to Sanskritize everything, because, as we know, the regime of Modi today is run by is informed largely by Hindutva ideals. But when you're making movies for the popular masses, which is Bollywood doing, this is not high literature. This is people who are many of whom are illiterate, but they know Persian vocabulary and they use it every day. Uh, so Bollywood, in a sense, is preserving this earlier um, moment when Persian language entered into all these vernacular tongues, and especially when it comes to the use of songs
Sure.
in Bollywood, basically it's Urdu.
Right.
And Urdu is very Persianized, much more than Hindi is.
Right.
So that's the point. The Persian language has entered into popular culture in very dramatic and insignificant ways, and that is not going to change. You cannot get rid of that.
Right.
You've got 1.4 billion people who are speaking these vernacular languages, and Persian has been used for 1,000 years in many of these languages.
I'll get back to this question again, to this whole conversation, specifically vis-a-vis the ideas of Sanskrit cosmopolis, Persian cosmopolis, and categories of religion and state and power and the law, which I specifically want to get into later, but I don't want to dominate the entire conversation, and my professors, Dr. Dariush Rahmanian and Dr. Murshid, who have given me this space, so I would like to hand over to them so that I don't really take much time, and then if there's time I will get back to this conversation again. Dr. Murshid, if you would like to go, or Dr. Rahmanian.
Okay,
Thank
Dr.
you so-
Rahmanian.
Yes. Please continue, Dr. Murshid.
Thank you. Dear Professor Eaton,
Yes.
from different point of view, and we can approach your narrative of the history of India and the history of Indian-Iranian relations, or history of the Persian world. What is more interesting for me as a student, actually, as a reader or general reader, not a specialist, is that I think you offer us a different definition of the language. I mean, the Persian language. Persian language not just as a communicating tool of communication between the countries, between the people, but actually a vessel of cultures, and a very effective tool to reform the identities. For example, you're focused on this period from early millennium to late 18th century. It's a long period of time, for example, in India, a long period of time, a very long period of time. And during this long period, the Indian identity is changed and transformed through cultural maybe development. And here, Persian language, it seems very effectively plays a very effective role, I think. And from this perspective, I think we can find a different definition of language, as we can find a different definition of religion as a cultural structure. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that a comment. I fully agree that this is there are many ways of looking at how Persian language was used in India. On the one hand, and this is where it's closest to Sanskrit, literature informed the way in which people thought. For example, under the Mughals, high-ranking servants of the empire, the Mansabdars, so-called, basically read the same books. They were trained, they were encouraged to read the works of Sa'di and Hafez, and the Shahnameh was translated, in fact, or given, let's say, Indian versions of it, Persian versions, but they were taking Ferdowsi's work and applying it to Indian realities. I'm thinking of, for example, in the 14th century, the historian Isami, who was in the Deccan, South India, wrote a book entitled the Shahnameh Hind, which was an adaptation of Ferdowsi and using the arguments of kingship that were elaborated by Ferdowsi to apply to the newly established Bahmani kingdom in the south that was rebelling against North India and was using Shahnameh as an argument for establishing an independent state in the Deccan. So you have on the one level this elite usage of Persian texts, especially discourses, not just poetry, but discourses, were translated. Things like or adapted into vernacular languages. But you also have Persian used as a contact language. That is to say, people whose first language was maybe Turkish or even Russian. In the Silk Road, merchants would use among themselves one language that was used across the whole area was Persian. I mentioned Marco Polo. Well, his first language, of course, was Italian, but he could communicate with Chinese through a medium of Persian, which neither one of them spoke as a first language, but it was used as a contact language. So you have three uses. One is as an elite language of texts which were traveling across this whole area. Secondly, as a contact language. And thirdly, as an administrative language. Obviously, Persian has a long tradition of the technology of administration, going back to the Persian Empire of Cyrus the Great and Darius, where you have a specialized class of professional administrators. Even though the empires change, the class of administrators remains. And as we well know, when the Arabs conquered Iran, the Arabs had to rely upon Persian using administrators because there was already a tradition of administering large imperial states. And the same thing is true in India. That the Persian already had a tradition of administrative technology. The whole notion of the people of the pen, the Ahl Kalam, was carried into India. And you have a ready-made toolkit, as it were, for how to administer a large empire. So I'm arguing that you have these three uses of Persian as a high literature tradition, as a contact language, and as an administrative language. And each one of these, in different ways, integrated India into this larger Persianate world.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Dr. Morshallu, if you want to, or Dr. Rahmanian.
Dr. Rahmanian, for the question, then we will be back to discussion.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Eaton. And I have to confess, I haven't read your book yet. I mean, Persian India in the Persianate age, but I read many things about you on internet, and I saw some your lectures and your videos on YouTube, and I know your approach about the India in the pre-colonial history, and I would like to ask you about your conceptual framework, because your conceptual framework is based on the Persianate and Persian world. But I would like to ask you, how about Islamicate? Can we use Islamicate as a tool about the transmission of the Indian identity during this period from 1000 to 18th century?
Thank you for that, Professor Mahmanian. Yes, that's a very good question. The word Islamicate was coined in the early 1970s by Marshall Hodgson.
Yes.
And it was a very fruitful idea. And he used it in order to conceptualize a Muslim world that was much larger than simply the Arab world. Before Marshall Hodgson, Islam, I mean, I'm thinking of people like Gibb and von Grunebaum and all these early European Orientalists conceived of Islam as basically an Arab religion. Uh, and Marshall Hodgson was the scholar who opened up the Islamic world as being much, much, much larger than simply the Arab world. And so he invented this word Islamicate to talk about Indonesia, to talk about Africa, West Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Anatolia, of course, Central Asia. He wanted to integrate much larger area of the world, which is correct, which is absolutely, it was a very necessary correction he made. However, the problem with the word Islamicate is that it contains the word Islam, and it implies that it necessarily has something to do with religion. And if you look at the actual data that Marshall Hodgson used to illustrate this Islamic world, he would talk about things like archaic architecture in India, which is to say, structures that looked like mosques that were not mosques, or literature that was being used in contexts that were not necessarily specifically religious in nature. And when you look closely at the data that he uses to discuss this Islamic world, it's largely Persian inspired, which is to say pre-Islamic, actually. It was the Sasanians who had developed many of the where there were the Sasani dynasty inspired much of the idea of domes, and we know that from what's in Iran today. And that was brought into India by Muslims, to be sure, but it was not originally necessarily Islamic. If we mean by Islam a religious tradition. So my use of the word Persianate is intended to draw attention to the non-religious dimension that Marshall Hodgson was referring to. And I think it's more accurate to use the word Persianate when there is no evidence of religion being part of it. For example, if you look at the architecture in Hindu states in South India, like Vijayanagara, we have secular buildings that were used for administration that look just like mosques. They have domes and they have arches, the same arches and the same domes that one would find in a Persian mosque or any mosque of the Middle East. And I came to realize that the reason they're using this kind of architecture is because it had trans-regional prestige, but it was not Islamic. It was not referring to anything that was used dealing with the Islamic religion. And so I think the word Persianate is a more accurate word to describe this phenomenon of the diffusion of culture that can be assimilated by non-Muslims very readily. I mean, for example, the word sultan, which is an Arabic word, of course, was readily adopted by Hindu kings simply because it had prestige. It was, and Hindu kings wanted to be part of this larger world. They were not simply a Raja or Maharaja, but they were also a Sultan. With one more word they would add to uh, their self-description. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that I think that Marshall Hodgson made a very important contribution in generating this word Islamicate. But I think that it needs to be nuanced. It needs to be modified somewhat. And I think the word Persianate is a better word to use when we're referring to phenomena that are not at all had anything to do with Islam or any religion. I mean, the use of the Persian language in administration is certainly not Islamicate, as far as I can see.
Yeah.
So that's the reason. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
If I may actually extend on this argument and just probably ask a different question, but which relates to this. So, then, for example, in 1582, Persian becomes kind of official, and then kind of around the same time, there is the project of Sulh-Kol, right? But in the middle of the 16th century, when you have, the 17th century, when you have Aurangzeb coming to power, things start to change. And then, like, if you want to get into this analytical lens of history, and then now think about the religion as a category, how do we really understand this shift, for example, from Akbar to Aurangzeb and the changing policies in terms of its kind of, religious undertones? And of course, I'm aware of your fascinating work on the Bengal frontier and the spread of Islam. You have a very fascinating argument there, which you kind of connected to the realm of agriculture, etc. And you argue that it's not primarily the kind of religious motives, but other things are kind of contributing. Based on the conversation that we have had so far and the idea of language and these etiquettes and ethos of the language that is kind of informing this kind of elite culture, how do we really understand the category of religion here, A? And B is that anyway the empire also has to function on certain kind of ideas of law and legal normativity. And it has to draw from, let's say, from a lexicon of law, which is kind of indebted to specific notions of, legality, Islamic jurisprudence, etc. So I'm interested to understand this religious kind of policies.
Yeah.
How do we understand that within the framework of the Persian cosmopolis, within that ethos? And the second one, how do we understand the category and concept of law and Islamic law as the kind of apparatus of empire functioning, and we're mediating between the people or subjects of the empire, and how do we really connect that to the idea of the cosmopolis?
Right. Thank you very much for those questions. And they're very good questions. Well, I guess my first is when you introduce the issue of Akbar and Aurangzeb, there's an old argument that we still find in history books today that Akbar was this great king who tried to harmonize Hindus and Muslims. You mentioned this notion of Sulh-Kol, peace with all, which was one of the ideas that was promulgated by him. That's very true. And historians still, even today, like to contrast Akbar, kind of the good Akbar, with the evil Aurangzeb. The trope being, and the British were, again, I think, responsible for this idea, largely responsible, not entirely responsible. The idea that Aurangzeb more or less destroyed what Akbar had created by, even in Pakistani textbooks today, you'll see Aurangzeb heralded as a great king who was trying to save Islam in India. And in India itself, of course, he is vilified as a villain. I mean, movies come out in Bollywood even today, which project this idea of Aurangzeb as an evil figure who was who's vilified, and the person that everybody loves to hate. Not everybody, but many Hindus do. So I go back to the fundamental idea of what an empire is. Empires are basically concerned with three things: stability, loyalty, and revenue. They know that religion and confusing religion with governance can only get you in trouble. One of the ironies is that it was not under Akbar, but under Aurangzeb that you had the greatest growth of the Muslim community in India. This is something that I tried to understand with respect to Bengal, which has the second largest number of Muslims in the world after Arabs. And the question that I studied for many years was, how did that happen? How do we explain the second largest Muslim ethnic community, which are Bengalis? How did that happen? Well, it happened largely due to transformations in the world of agriculture, as you just mentioned. But it also happened under this emperor, Aurangzeb, who's usually vilified as hating Hindus. And so that's a problem. And I see Aurangzeb as conforming to the same thing that most Indian emperors did, whether they were Hindu or Muslim, doesn't matter. They're all interested in stability, loyalty, and revenue. But Aurangzeb has been drastically misunderstood, it seems to me. You look at his philosophy of governance. He employed more Hindus at the highest ranks of the administration than any emperor before him. He specifically discouraged making appointments based on religion, even though that was offered to him. Of course, he was responsible for destroying temples, but most every ruler has done that, including Hindus, because temples are oftentimes identified with enemies. And since temples serve to justify kingship, according to Hindu understandings of governance, destroying them, or at least desecrating them, is something which had been done for centuries, long before Muslims came to India. This had been going on. So the point about religion is a very important one, but it needs to be put in the context of the larger agenda of how do you govern a large multicultural society. Introducing religion has very little to do with proper governance. And Aurangzeb certainly understood this. In fact, he cited the Quran specifically, saying, my religion is for me, your religion is for you. And he was doing this in the context of pleas that were made to him that he should be discriminating on the basis of religion. So there's that. Then there's the question of the Sharia. You mentioned law. And it's also important to note that the word Sharia, as it was used in the 16th and 17th centuries, and into the 18th century for that matter, did not really mean exclusively Islamic law, which is what we think today. The word Sharia was really understood in vernacular usage across India as simply being the proper custom. And it was given a more specifically Islamic tone only when the British came. It was in Warren Hastings, one of the earliest governor generals of the East India Company, basically divided Indians according to Muslims with Mohammedan law, as he called it, Hindus with their Hindu law, the Dharma Shastras, And the idea of you have two different communities with separate legal traditions was largely a function of the British need to separate these people. My point being that if you look at the data from the pre-British period in the 17th century, in the 16th, 17th, early 18th century, you had as many Hindus using the Sharia as you did Muslims. In fact, you had more. The Sharia was simply a code of how we regulate society. And it was, of course, the Qazis were largely themselves Muslim. They were trained in the law, and they administered it. But it was, when you consider property law, inheritance law, marriage law, all these things are, of course, encompassed in the Sharia, but they were utilized by non-Muslims as much as they were by Muslims. All of that is difficult to understand today because we're living in a post-colonial world, and our understanding of pre-colonial is largely structured by what happened in the colonial period, when these terms were intended to refer to separate communities. And this, of course, takes us back to the partition of 1947, which only reinforced that notion of separateness. But the questions you're raising are absolutely fundamental. I mean, the nature of and Aurangzeb is a very complicated figure. All of us are complicated. There's no single note that explains any one of us. We all have different, like a diamond is cut with very different facets, and we change. Aurangzeb changed. Akbar changed. Right? Akbar began his career by persecuting Hindus. He declared himself the Shah-e-Islam, the king of Islam, and and for a while. He evolved, and so did Aurangzeb. And so it's difficult to characterize any one person in a single monotone. We have to see them as changing and as complex, and put them in their own context instead of trying to project our values onto them, which is unfortunately what people are accustomed to doing too much.
Thank you so much. This is great. We probably on our side we have 5 more minutes, and then we can ask the audience. I have 2 more general questions, but I will basically hold on to them so that if Professor Rahmanian or Professor Morshidlu want to go ahead, and then I go after them with my questions. Those are general ones.
Thank you, Kuya. And Professor Eaton, I have a different question, and you have a book in your works, The Rise of Islam and the Bengal Frontier.
Right.
I would like to ask you, what does frontier mean in this title?
Thank you. Very good question. Well, it's a good question because in America, the word frontier implies the idea of civilization on one side and barbarism or savages on the other side. There's a very important historian who evolved this theory in the late 19th century, about the 1880s, when the American frontier was declared to be closed. There was no longer a movement. And from the East Coast to the West Coast. And the idea being that there was this empty space largely inhabited by savages, Indians, Native Americans, and it was being replaced by white settlers who moved into their space. And as this happened, civilization was being imposed on an area that had previously been a kind of an empty zone or a zone of barbarism. And it was a moving frontier. This idea, I think, is fundamentally flawed. Civilization replacing barbarism or savagery, but rather a contact zone between different kinds of peoples. And this contact zone, in cultural terms, was moving from west to east. And as it was moving, it was paralleled by other kinds of frontiers, most importantly, an environmental or ecological frontier that was patterned by the movement of rivers. So as rivers were moving from west to east, the fertility of the soil increased. And this enhanced agriculture, so that agriculture and political authority were moving into an area that was previously jungle. And the inhabitants of that jungle were being absorbed into a new kind of society, an agrarian society, rice farming, especially rice farming. So elaborate several ideas. One of them is the idea that a frontier is not static, it's moving. Why does it move? It's moving because the rivers are changing. And the rivers are changing because of geology, the natural dynamics of how rivers work. In Bengal, especially, the long-term history is one of the fertility of the soil moving from the western side to the eastern side. So I wanted to understand why was it that Islam became more prevalent in the eastern Bengal and not western Bengal. And it occurred to me that the answer seems to be that Muslim communities emerged as the eastern side was becoming opened up for agriculture and opened up by pioneers who one of the requirements of obtaining land grants from the Mughal regime was that a pioneer had to build either a temple or a mosque. The government did not care. Again, government doesn't care about religion. They just want stability. And they knew that if you have a temple, that will give a certain a Hindu temple will give a certain stability to a local society. If you have a mosque, same thing. It'll give stability to a society that was neither Hindu nor Muslim beforehand. So what you have in Eastern Bengal was the growth of a predominantly Muslim community because most of the pioneers happened to be Muslim, and therefore there were more mosques that were built than temples. So it's a very complicated kind of frontier, but it's one that is not just political. It was political itself into the East, but it was also religious and it was also ecological. So there were three kinds of frontiers that were overlapping each other and moving into this region at the same time. It's a complicated argument. But in a simple term, that's what I was trying to say. Yes. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Professor Eaton.
Yes. And ask another question very briefly or
Yes.
not? No. Dear Puya, am I allowed to
Please,
have
of
enough
course,
time?
of course, please.
Yes. I would like to ask Professor Eaton, and as a historian, how do you define yourself, and in which genre and approach in historiography you define yourself? Social history, cultural history, history of thought, history of religion, history of civil history, because in your works we see many approaches And you mentioned in somewhere, as I remember, you have been influenced by analytical tools and Weberian social thoughts. I would like to hear about yourself as a historian and about your definition in the historiography.
Thank you very much for that. Well, I was trained in history at the University of Wisconsin in the 1960s and 70s at a time when world history was first to become taught, global history. And before the 1960s, history in America was largely taught as either European or American. The rest of the world was not really well integrated into the whole story. It was people like Marshall Hodgson, I mentioned it before, but there are many other people that William McNeill, Alfred Crosby, many historians were writing in the 60s and early 70s that were trying to figure out ways in which the rest of the world could be integrated. And I happened to be at Wisconsin at a time when Philip Curtin was teaching. Now, Phil Curtin really invented the history of Africa in America. African history became a major subfield under his direction. And he had a special program at Wisconsin called Comparative Tropical History. Comparative Tropical History, by which he meant looking at the world through the lens of comparison. So we're not talking about one region, like you have the history of France, the history of Iran, the history of China. No, he wants to look at comparative history across space. And he wants to look at the tropical world, especially, and the way in which societies interacted with each other, especially in the era of European colonialism. So he taught me something about comparative history, which I did not know. The other influence that I had when I was a graduate student was reading French historiography, especially the Annales school of Marc Bloch and Fernand Braudel, who were trying to understand total history, as social history, cultural history, economic history, political history, military history, environmental history, yeah, everything, intellectual history. And what Braudel wanted to do was to put all this together and understand how these are interacting with each other. So he wrote his famous History of the Mediterranean Sea. Nobody had done this before, looking at the Mediterranean Sea as the unit geographically. And when I was very much influenced by that, because when I looked at Bengal, I quickly understood that if we want to understand religion, we need to understand the environment. We need to understand the history of the rivers, the history of the jungle, of agriculture, and put this together. Unfortunately, most universities are still divided by disciplines, where you have a department of religious studies, they study religion. A department of geography, they study geography. Politics, these people don't talk to each other. They don't read each other's books. Art, architecture, you cannot take that out of the story. You have to talk about that, because these are physical texts is just as important as a literary text is a work of architecture. And so I tried to integrate art and architecture into my work as well. And I guess to answer your question, I do not define myself exclusively as a social historian or a cultural historian. I simply define myself as a historian and who is trying to understand how different disciplines are interacting with each other. A good example of that was in the about 20 years ago when I co-authored a book with a colleague, Philip Wagner, who studies architecture and art of India. He proposed that he and I go to the Deccan Plateau and look at material evidence, by which he meant going around looking at hill fortresses that were built between the 13th and the 17th, 18th centuries. Well, this was a big thing for me, a new way of looking at the world. Before that time, I had done most of my historical work by going to libraries. My first book was written entirely on Persian manuscripts that I found in Hyderabad in South India. My Bengal book was based mainly on Persian documents I found in Bengal, in Bangladesh. But it was only when I met Phil Wagner that I discovered there was much more besides sitting in a library or sitting in an archive at material evidence, looking at canons, looking at architecture, looking at granaries, looking at the physical built environment and what happens physically when one fort is conquered by another one. What do they do with the architecture of the people they've defeated? Do you keep it there? Do you destroy it? Do you modify it? Do you redefine it? These are all questions that are political in nature, but they can only be understood by looking at material evidence. So I guess to answer that very important question of yours, Professor Rahmanian, I have to say I keep looking for a wider lens to understand any single phenomenon. Because nothing can be fully understood if you're only looking at from one angle. We need to see it from all angles, or as many angles as we can. That's my short answer.
No, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
But we can consider you as interdisciplinary historian.
Exactly. That's the word. Precisely. That's the correct word.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Eaton. The final remarks were so great that I was just thinking about that, and it was a great honor to listen to you. And I think, I don't know, it's a different scholarly work. It was a different scholarly world back then when you were basically learning about all of that. So it's great to hear that you're connecting all these words together, and it's fascinating to.
We're trying to. It's not always successful, but
right.
That's the goal.
Right.
Yeah.
I think we are a little beyond time. I had other questions I wanted to ask about the late 18th century, but I think maybe I will just open it to the audience if they have a question. We may have about, let's say, five minutes or so, and then we're done. And so it's open for the audience if they have a question or if they want to say even hi. Please, yeah. Dr. Khakzad. Yeah.
Hi everyone, thank you very much, Puyajan, for organizing this session, and also Professor Eaton and all other professors and friends in Iran. So I have a question about this, I think I want to say, concept of time. In the beginning, you talked about your dissatisfaction with the projection of these dark ages to the time that
Right.
Muslims were ruling India, and so my understanding was that this pre-Islamic time was a kind of prestigious time to the Europeans' views, and the Muslim time was this negative understanding of the history of India. But since my interest is understanding of time and the concept of time, my question is that so many Orientalists represent the understanding of time in Sanskrit or in Indian understanding as negative, cyclical, but I was curious to know how they also represented the time from the perspective of Muslims that was linear and more aligned to this Christian time. So if you have any reflection on that, I really appreciate it. And also I have another question that are you happy with the translation of your book's title to Persian? Because I think now I heard Iranigari. And do you think that this translation for Persianate to Iranigari is
ایرانی معابی.
Irani Mawabi is are you satisfied? Because I think this Iranianness also is different from Persian or Persianate, and
Yes.
sometimes I myself use Indo-Persianate word. So if you also can reflect on these topics,
Right.
I really appreciate it. Thank you.
So happy you raised that question, Professor Khazad. Frankly, I'm not familiar with this word Ma'abi. And I was curious myself when I saw the book. I mean, I was given this with I showed it before. This is the image of the book, right? I'm looking at the title, you know, uh, Hind Dardoraya Irani Ma'abi. I'm not
Yeah.
quite sure. I'm not quite sure I understand what that means, and I would be interested to hear any of you. How would you translate that word? How do you, I mean, I'm not quite sure I understand that word. That's my word. But I'm not sure what I would use to replace that because the word Persianate is obviously an English term based on an English grammatical formation, something like German, Germanic, or Spanish, Hispanic, or Italian, Italianate. You could take an adjective, a noun, make it into an adjective by putting that at the ending. But there's no direct Persian equivalent that I can think of. So I would like to hear from you, anyone, about what you think of that word, the that Doreye Irani Maabi.
No.
Yeah, what does anyone have any thoughts on that?
So myself, I use Parsi-Garai.
Parsi,
Parsin, and I don't use even Farsi. I use Parsi when I
Parsi,
want to address the 19th century,
right?
historical developments that was very much impacted by these Parsi Zoroastrians in Iran. So, but I think about all these terms, Islamicate, Persianate, and also I had some problems even with Persianate, and I most of the time try to use Indo-Persianate because so my historical findings reveals that how much these also Indian thoughts were influential in the formation of the concept of time that I'm working on it, and it wasn't just Persianate. So, but every time that I use these terms, I think that they are some problems, they generate some problems, and they hide some
That's
truth.
true.
But and so I was curious to know, what you think about these terms, or Parsigari, that I prefer this
Parsigari.
Parsigarai or Parsi instead of Farsi or Irani. Yeah, and when I talk about specifically these, Parsi Zoroastrians and their relationship with Iranian history, I really think that Parsi is a better uh, term here, but uh, I'm thinking about these terms, and I
Right.
wanted to hear more about it from all you scholars who are working on these topics. And also, I think this, please, if you have time, also answer the question about this concept of time. Yeah, because there are two very different questions. Thank you so much.
Yeah, they are. Yeah.
So, Professor Eaton, you disagree with the translation Persianate to Irani Ma'abi, yes? You
Well,
disagree with trans
to me, I don't really understand how that translates, and I would be because I'm not familiar with this word Malabi, uh, and I would
in
appreciate.
Iran we don't have any problem with this translation.
Okay,
It's so familiar for us. Irani Ma'abi, yes. And Parsi-Gerai or Parsi Ma'abi or Parsi-Gari is not correct. Yes. Irani Ma'abi, yeah.
the word Persianate is similar to other English terms like Germanic. I mean, you have German as a language, and Germanic refers to the civilization that is informed by the literature in German.
Yeah,
Spanish is a language. Hispanic is the
yeah,
civilization that is informed by literature in Spanish,
yeah,
and so forth. And so it's and Greek, of course, is the language, and Hellenic or Hellenistic is the broader culture that's informed by Greek language. So when we're trying to move into the world of Persian, to find an exact equivalent uh, is baffling to me. I really, it's a problem. But you seem to have no problem with the word Irani Ba'abi,
no, no, for us, no, no.
because that you
There
okay.
is
So
no problem.
you're happy
Yeah,
with the translation.
yes,
Okay.
yes, of course, yes.
Yeah. The question of time, Dr. Khazad, is a and I know you've worked on this yourself with calendars and so forth. And you know much more than I do about that side of it. I'm aware. But I am interested in time insofar as when we speak of ages. Historians are constantly vexed and challenged by trying to divide up time, which ultimately cannot be divided. If you look at a river, it's like trying to carve up a river into clear divisions when there is no clear division. It's the same water is flowing down unbroken, unless there's a dam somewhere. But if otherwise, it's arbitrary. Yet we have to have units because we can't talk about all time uh, in any given course. We have to make it manageable. Um, so we are always faced with the problem of imposing our categories onto the past, and that involves devising criteria. What divides one period from another one? And the Europeans did this beginning already in the 14th century with the Italian Renaissance, with this awakening. The word Renaissance means rebirth, when they were rediscovering this Greco-Roman civilization that had been uh, defeated and almost forgotten. So they're translating these books from Greek into vernacular languages of Europe and so forth. So there was a feeling of a break between an earlier period and a present era. That was a very powerful idea that obviously has survived down to the present day. We still have this idea. I mean, many of my colleagues still see history in terms of ancient, medieval, and modern. It's very deeply ingrained in our understanding. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, the British simply projected that same idea onto India, even though it doesn't exactly fit.
But if I may,
Sure.
so I was asking about the perspective of Orientalists, in the time that you
Right.
examine that. So because as I
Right.
know, these Orientalists really negatively represented the Indian time, or they
Yes.
just.
Yes, they did.
Hmm.
That's right. For them, and Orientalism, of course, was coincided with the British Raj, the rule in India. So it was natural that the Orientalists brought to their understanding of India this conception of an exotic East, an Orient, uh, which they nonetheless, transposed this European conception of the tripartite division. Um, and it goes back to when I was originally approached by Penguin Books to write this book. They wanted me to write a history of medieval India. And I refused to use that word medieval because it suggests middle. And middle in Indian history means the period after the Hindus and before the British. And that only reinforced this category that the Orientalists were imposing during the British period. So it was a difficult dilemma, but I still believe that the idea of Persianate is a more useful term because it is not constrained by these political boundaries. One of my own criticisms of my own book, if I may do this, the Persianate age actually extends well beyond 1765. If you read the subtitle of my book, it says 1000 to 1765. That implies that the Persianate age stopped in the year 1765, and that is absolutely not true. You know, as you know you interviewed Professor Dudley recently in his work in the 18th century. The Persianate world extends well beyond 1765 through the 18th, through the 19th, into the 20th century, of course. In many respects, it's still alive even now. Uh, so, I look back at my own work and I'm not happy with um, having to put the date on there of 1765, but that was imposed by the publisher who did not want my book to go too far into the British colonial period, you see. So that's a problem. And I probably should have discussed that more in the book itself. But now that I'm reflecting on it, it seems to me that, this is a problem, and this is always a problem when you're writing history. Where do you stop? And why do you stop at the point you did? It's the same problem in world history too. My professor I mentioned earlier, my own professor at Wisconsin, Philip Curtin, used to say that writing world history especially, is always a problem of deciding which bad compromise is less bad than all the other bad compromises. You see, it's never going to be perfect and neat. There's going to be rough edges. There's going to be problems you cannot really solve easily. And you put your finger on one of them, which is this question of time and periods. It's messy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry, I was muted. Thank you so much, Professor Eaton. It was great having you. It was a great honor for us to hear you here today and learn more about the book. And it was a fascinating conversation, and it always really makes me to go and read further. It's never ending. Yeah.
It never ends.
Yeah, never ends.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because many historians, many scholars, when they finish their book and it's finally published, they think that it's all over. I've said the last word. And of course, there is never a last word. Somebody will come along and refute everything you say and revise it. And that's what scholarship always does. So that's good. That's a good thing. You're trying to provoke more discussion and more arguments.
Right, yeah.
Thank you for affording me this opportunity to discuss it not only with you, but with all my friends in Iran.
Thank you so much, Professor Eaton.
Yeah, there is no any question of our audience.
I'm waiting if someone, of course, we're open to everyone, but...
And how about Mr. Dr. Morshidlu?
Thank you. I really enjoyed the conversation. It's very inspiring and very fascinating. Thank you, Puya, for providing this opportunity. It's a great honor for me. And actually, I learned many things from the conversation. And many of our audiences are educated students, our students in Iran from different universities in Tehran and the other cities. They actually accept our invitation. Thank you, the students and the attendees. Thank you. Thank you, Puya. Thank you, Professor. And it was a great honor for me.
Thank you so much. And I will stop recording it. Yeah.
I would like to ask my last question, dear Puya.
Sure.
Dear Professor Eaton, when you were young, you came in Iran and stayed in Tabriz for 2 years.
2 years.
Have you ever been in Iran after that? How many times or not?
Several times. Okay, I was in Iran. Yes, thank you for raising that, Professor.
And you are still young too. Yeah.
Well, no, not that.
Yeah.
Well, I actually went to Iran in the time of President Kennedy in 1962, 1964, 2 years. And I was sent to Tabriz. I loved Tabriz. It was a great experience to live up there. I was not actually in the city. I was in a village nearby, Saeedabad. They had these schools called the Danish Saray Keshavazi, which were these agricultural normal schools. They were training. The Shah had just initiated the land reform.
Yes.
As you know, Azerbaijan was the first province that undergo.
Yes.
This takes us into modern Iranian history, of course. But so we were all part of that program. We were teaching agriculture in these Danish Sarah. And I had the good fortune of seeing much of Iran in those 2 years. I had the greater fortune that my own parents were living in Mashhad at that time. So they actually greeted me at the Fururgah Mehrabad in Tehran when we arrived November 1962. So I saw them several times while I was in Iran. But it was while I was in Iran, I made a trip to India, and with 2 other Peace Corps volunteers. And for me, I immediately recognized much of what I now understand as Persianate civilization. If you go to the Taj Mahal, And
Tarjuma.
you instantly understand this is obviously Persian. In fact, the architects came from Shiraz. Two of them did. And you look at the Urdu script, it's Persian script. You look at the cuisine, much of the food, the kebabs, the biryani, and so forth, it's all Persian. The clothing, much of it is Persian. The language, you find Persian everywhere. So I, from my very first trip from Iran to India, I was already seeing this connection. Although I could not formulate any intellectual argument to explain it, I understood it was there. So in a sense, the book that we've been just talking about today had its own beginnings in 1963 when I went to India for 1 month and came back. I did go back to Iran several times. I went back in 1976, I think it was, on my way to Lahore, Pakistan. And I spent a week in Tehran. And then again, I went in 2020, I think 2011 or 12, as a tourist group of 35 Americans. And we went through big Gaidesh everywhere. We started in Tehran and went to Mashhad, Kerman, Yazd, Shiraz, Isfahan, Tabriz, Urumia. It was great. And I had a wonderful time, and I very much look forward to coming back to Iran. This is my ambition, and I will do it. I will. I promise.
We hope
Great. We'll
see
be
you
ready.
again.
I've never been to the Tehran University, but I have many colleagues in America who were educated, trained in Tehran at the university, and obviously maintain very close connections. So this is my ambition. I would love to come and return. And Tabriz, of course.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
I would look forward to that.
It's a great day for all of us, and thank you so much
That
for
would
this
be great
gift
day.
and presence. Yeah.
We'll do that. Thank you.
So I think I'll stop the recording.